Hello everyone. So for this project, we are going to be deploying. We are going to be writing a full DevOps pipeline to deploy a scalable e-commerce web app infrastructure. So we're going to be using different tools to develop to craft the full pipeline as the architecture. So we're going to be using AWS. That also use Terraform as infrastructure as code for cloud provisioning to provide our EC2 instance, the VPC, the S3 bucket, the database, and the rules. Then we're going to be using Ansible for configuration management. If you can see, we have the different folders here. We have Ansible, we have for the app, Argo CD, the documents, Jenkins, Kubernetes, monitoring. That's monitoring for Prometheus and Grafana. Then Terraform for infrastructure as code. That's to provision the cloud services. So we'll also be using Jenkins. That's for the pipeline, the CI/CD pipeline where we'll write in our Jenkins file for checkout stage, building, testing, and deploying. So we'll also be using Docker to containerize the application and Kubernetes for container orchestration. We'll be using Kubernetes, specifically the EKS. Then we'll be using Argo CD for GitOps for deployment, and SonarQube for code quality and analysis, and Prometheus and Grafana for monitoring, as I earlier said. So firstly, the flow for this project will be from Terraform provisioning the AWS infrastructure, Ansible to configure each instance, that is configure the Jenkins server, because we're going to be provisioning two instances. Our Windows subsystem for Linux will be acting as our Ansible control node, while we provision the Jenkins server and the web server that the application is going to be deployed to. Then we're using Ansible for Ansible to configure the instance, that's Jenkins, and the app-based setup. Then the developer pushes the code to GitHub. So push the code to GitHub. Then Jenkins pipeline runs the link code of flag it or else in, runs test, PyTest, runs the SonarQube analysis. That's for code quality analysis. Builds the Docker image and push to Docker Hub. Then push to Kubernetes manifest to GitHub. Then Argo CD auto deploys the new version of the EKS. Prometheus now scraps the metrics and Grafana displays the dashboard. So as you can see, we have started. The first thing I will have to do, as according to our flow, is to provision with Terraform. That's infrastructure as code. So you see, we're providing our EC2.tf provider. That's the main provider. We have our TF state. We have variables.tf and the VPC. So we're provisioning the VPC. So you see, I've already provisioned this. As you can see from, so after writing your code for provisioning, you first of all, for Terraform, you use Terraform best practices. So you need to initialize Terraform. As you can see, Terraform init, to have Terraform FMT to format your code, and Terraform validate to validate the code to make sure everything is corresponding. Then you plan to see how your infrastructure is planned, and then you apply to create your results. So if we go to our dashboard, you see that we have two instances here. This is for the Jenkins server, and if you go back to instances, you see that this is for the web server. Now for the next part, which is configuration, you will have to configuration management, where you are able to use Ansible to configure your servers. Now, so since we have to configure the Jenkins server to install Jenkins and start the server to be able to use, since Jenkins will act as our CI/CD pipeline, so you have to be able to allow Jenkins to SSH into the Jenkins EC2 server. So how to do that? So for that to happen, you have to copy your key pair. I've already done that. You have to copy your key pair and make sure your key pair is in the .ssh folder in your local machine, your WSM, in the for Ansible. So if you come So if we so to see into the Jenkins server, see automatically we're in the Jenkins Institute server. So that's how you SSH into the server. So that so the next step we have is configuration management with Ansible. So you can see our playbooks are running. So we're trying to configure the Jenkins server. So if you go to our Ansible folder, you have our inventory.ini that specifies a particular server to configure, and then you have a Jenkins setup.yml.yaml that specify the different tags. So for the tags here, if you look at our Jenkins setup.yaml, we have to configure Jenkins EC2 instance. That we have to configure instead Jenkins on that instance. It specifies the host is the particular server. Then the tags we have to update first the server. Then you install Java. So Jenkins needs Java. Java is one of the requirements for Jenkins to be able to run on a particular server. So installing open the JDK 17 and it's all the dependencies. You add Docker, you add Docker, install Docker, then add Jenkins user as to the Docker group, that's Ubuntu and Docker. Then you install Jenkins and start Jenkins. Then you enable and start Jenkins. So if you look, so have you run the playbook, Ansible playbook, the inventory specifies the particular server, then the playbook. So you see, you go through, have configured tags that's gathering the servers. First task, update the server. Second task, install the Java dependencies. Java, that's Jenkins requirement. Install your other dependencies. Add the Docker, GPG key. Add Docker group. Add Jenkins user to Docker group. All the tasks, as you can see, basically around installing. So it completed the task. So if you go now to that server, we should be able to see Jenkins installed in that particular Jenkins server. So after using Ansible for configuration management to configure the Jenkins server and install Jenkins and its dependencies on the Jenkins server, so you have to SSH in the Jenkins server. So this is our Jenkins server. So if you check the Java version, you say Java, you see the Java open JDK 17 version 17. So if we do system sudo systemctl status Jenkins, you see Jenkins is started and running. See active enabled, and it's active and running. So shows that our configuration management step with Ansible work perfectly. So if you want to go to the dashboard for Jenkins, we need the public IP address. So if you come and you use the public IP address on you Now for the next step, you have to dockerize the application. So if you come to our application folder, our app folder, so we have the back end, we have the front end. So for the back end, you have the application, the server.js, the package.json. So you have to dockerize. This is a Docker file for the back end from Alpine, from Node 18 Alpine. Then for the front end, you have the public, that's the HTML, you have the source, then you have the Docker file for the front end. As you can use Alpine, use Alpine 18 Alpine as builder. So have the Docker, then we have the Docker Compose. This one we use to test it test locally to see if everything in the application is working and everything. So if we go to our terminal, so if you come down to our terminal, you see you run Docker Compose up build. It will build the application. As you can see that the application has been built. So this is the application, this is the end. So if you go to localhost 3000, localhost 3000, you'll be able to see the front end of the application, and localhost 5000, you'll be able to see the back end. So if you go to our browser, if you copy this link and go to the browser, so we're able to see our application e-commerce store. Welcome to our e-commerce store. So if you change it to localhost 5000, you'll be able to see the backend API. Sorry, 5000. So you see message, welcome to e-commerce API. So that's it for our our compose. So now the pipeline, it runs on any agent. So you use it. So if you see on the pipeline you have any agent, you use any Jenkins agent to run the pipeline. So for credentials, we'll create a Docker Hub credentials on Jenkins. So I'm going to replace with my username and the repositories I created in Docker Hub. So stage for this stage, it checks out and clones your repository in the main branch, then checks the front end for the next stage, front end lead, and runs the test, the front end lead test, lint test, and the back end lint test, the back end lint. Then now for the next stage, the back end test, it runs the back end test to see if everything is functional, is well functioned. Then for the stage, it builds now the image, the front end image. It builds the front end image and push to the Docker Hub repository named with e-commerce front end, name e-commerce front end. Then it also builds the back end image and push to Docker Hub and tags it to the back end repository in Docker Hub. Yeah, as you can see, it pushes the images to Docker Hub using your credentials. So after creating your pipeline, your Jenkins file, that's the Jenkins file, and creating your pipeline, the stages, the different stages for testing, building, and pushing to and creating the Docker image and pushing to Docker Hub. Now, when your pipeline is successful in your console, you see the stages. YAML, savings of the YAML, same as the front end, deployment of the YAML, savings of the YAML. So in the deployment of the YAML, you have to replace under containers, you replace your image with the image name that you have on Docker Hub. Same with the front end, you replace the image, with the image name you have on Docker Hub. So after creating your manifest Kubernetes manifest folder with the files for backend and front end and the rest and the namespace.yaml. The next is Argo CD. So after following the procedure to do the Argo CD, you come up with a URL that you have to log in with the admin and the code that you're going to get from. If you run this particular code, you're going to get the password for kubectl get secret Argo CD initial. So if you run this particular command, you're going to get the password to be able to use for to log into your Argo CD. Now this password is very secretive, so you have to keep it to yourself. So now this is the dashboard. We have already created and auto synchronize our application to it. So if you see, we are synchronized to main this, and the application is healthy. You see here app health, and then you see last synchronized here. The last step, we have to configure monitoring. So configure monitoring with Prometheus and Grafana to monitor metrics like the CPU usage, the health of the application. So if, for example, if you go to Argo